Okay, so I want to go through some of the answers to the feedback mechanisms packet. I'm going to skip over most of Model 1. I think hopefully it didn't give you too much trouble, but if you have questions about it, just email me. Looking at number 4 real quick, it's given the example of a puppy that you throw a ball, puppy chases it, you say good job. So is the puppy likely to do that again? Yes, right? You're giving it head pats and you're saying good job. And that's going to encourage the action to occur again. So in this case, the puppy chasing the ball was the stimulus, you saying good job and giving the head rub was the response, and that response then will lead to probably an increase in the stimulus. So for letter C here, that would be an example of positive feedback because the response encourages more of the stimulus. So an important thing to note there is that can become sort of a vicious loop, right? If you keep saying good job and the dog keeps chasing and getting the ball and you always say good job and the dog does it more and you do it more and you do it and dog, that could get pretty crazy pretty quickly, and eventually either you or the dog is going to have some sort of escape mechanism from this loop where either you're sick of throwing the ball or the dog's too tired to go running and get the ball, and that's going to exit us from that positive feedback loop. That's part of the reason why we don't see positive feedback loops quite as often in biological creatures, because there has to be sort of a secondary mechanism to get you out of it. So number 5 then, puppy pees on the couch. You say, no, bad dog, and you place it outside. So again, now this is negative feedback, which is to say that not negative because you're saying bad dog, negative because the action you're taking, the response you're taking, is going to decrease the stimulus. So you have the stimulus of the puppy urinates on the couch. You saying no, bad dog is the response, and because that response reduces the stimulus, that's an example of negative feedback. Okay, so number 6 then, which one's most useful for amplifying a condition? That's positive feedback. That's going to cause more of the stimulus that you saw. And for number 7, then stopping a condition would be negative feedback. Model 2 goes through an example that I think we're very familiar with. This is our typical go-to homeostasis example, right? You get too hot, your body cools down. You get too cold, your body warms up. So thermoregulation is essentially that. Right? So number 8 is that it's the way the body cools itself or increases its temperature. This is happening with the help of the hypothalamus. That'll be important because the next thing we're getting into is the endocrine system, and the hypothalamus will be a part of that that we'll be looking at a lot. So according to the model, we can see how it cools itself, how it warms itself up. I think we can read through that. Same thing with the stimulus and response. In this case, the stimulus in both cases, I believe, would be the change from normal body temperature, and the response would be these actions being taken: blood vessels contracting, muscles shivering, blood vessels dilating, or sweat being produced for each positive or negative, cooling or warming. Now, for the one that cools the body when it's too warm, so your body temperature is too high and these things come in and they cool you down. In this case, what's happening is you have a stimulus of an increased body temperature. These two things are the response, and they cause your body to restore to a normal temperature, which should then stop this stimulus. That this is a negative feedback loop because the dilation of your blood vessels and the increased production of sweat is going to cool you down and cause less of the stimulus that was triggering your hypothalamus. Going over to the side that heats the body when it's too cool, very similarly, we get outside of the normal body temperature range, so our body temperature goes lower. The hypothalamus responds with blood vessels constricting and the muscles shivering, and that restores the body temperature towards the normal range, and therefore again decreases the action. So this would again be negative feedback. So here we have a loop that has two sides, but both sides are utilizing negative feedback because both sides are acting when the conditions are a certain way, and the response to that action is to change the conditions back to normal, which therefore decreases the action So your temperature is too high, your body does these things. Those things mean your body doesn't have to do those things anymore, which is therefore an example of negative feedback. Okay, so that's important with both of those, that those are examples of negative feedback. So in this next little section here, it's directly relating this to homeostasis, and these are good questions, but the second one's a little weird. So for this first one, it says, would a positive feedback loop ever be helpful in maintaining homeostasis? No, really. And the reason is because a positive feedback loop has a stimulus which occurs, which causes a response, and that response therefore causes more of the stimulus, which would cause more of the response, which causes more of the stimulus and more of the response, and it becomes this endless cycle. In terms of maintaining homeostasis, that's not ideal. Homeostasis is all about this balance, right? Things are too high, bring them lower. Things are too low, bring them higher. And so a positive feedback loop may have very important functions inside of the body, but in terms of maintaining homeostasis, not really. We see positive feedback loops coming in as moments where the body needs to accomplish a specific thing. And similar to when I was talking about the loop of like you throw the ball and your dog goes and gets it and you head pat and you end up in this loop forever, similar to that, you need an exit strategy, some sort of like culminating event that exits you from that, which, as you see from Model 3, maybe my exits you from that is a little too appropriate in terms of a final event that's going to get you out of that positive feedback loop. For part B, would a single negative feedback loop ever be helpful? That single part is an important part of this question, because this one, again, the answer is kind of no. Imagine if you had just half of this. That wouldn't be very good, because you're going to be struggling to maintain the homeostasis of the body temperature if the only thing you can do is warm the body and you can't address what happens when the body becomes too hot. So would a single negative feedback loop ever be helpful? Probably not. I would say that question's a little tricky just because of the sort of emphasis that you'd have to place on the word single there to really address it. Typically you're going to need two sides to me, whether it's temperature or levels of glucose or the amount of water. Any sort of thing that can be too low can also be too high. So for maintaining homeostasis, you usually see sort of pairs of negative feedback loops that keep things where they should be. Okay. Now, once you've gone through and answered the questions, let's look at Model 3. So in this case, childbirth and contractions. This is a great example and a very common example for positive feedback loops. So in this case, we have this model here where we have a stimulus of the baby pushing against the cervix as the baby's ready to be born, which leads to a response of the uterine walls contracting. The reason why this is positive feedback is because as those contractions push on the baby therefore pushes against the cervix even more, causing more oxytocin to be released by the hypothalamus, causing more contractions, causing more pushing of the baby, and it's this building loop until baby is no longer on the inside, in which case then there's no more pushing on the cervix, which means there's no more oxytocin, which means there's no more contractions. And so here we can see a really good example of a positive feedback loop, which is causing a important action to occur, but it has an exit strategy. It has a way to sort of break the loop at the appropriate time. So the hormone is oxytocin for 16 when the intensity of the contractions increases. That causes an increase in the stimulus, which is why this is positive feedback. And what will eventually stop it? Birth. Okay. Going into these extra questions here. Here's just some quick scenarios. So in this case, we have human tissue that gets torn or cut, and the cells near the damage send a signal, activates platelets. As the platelets begin to form the plug, they release more signals that attract more platelets. Okay, so that right away sounds to me like positive feedback. We have a stimulus, which is you get a cut. We have a response, which is more platelets and other clotting factors. And those platelets and clotting factors cause even more platelets and clotting factors and even more platelets and clotting factors. And so we get into this loop of platelets arrive, they cause more platelets to be created and arrive, and cycle. It's positive feedback. And again, you have an exit strategy because at a certain point the cut is gone, in which case you sort of have a secondary thing stepping in and saying, okay, we're done. For the next one, somebody isn't drinking enough water, they become dehydrated, causes a loss of blood pressure, so they get ADH from the hypothalamus and the pituitary. That signals the kidneys to allow reabsorption of water, which is going to bring blood pressure back to normal. That sounds like negative feedback. We have a stimulus that's a loss of blood pressure. We have the response, which is the release of ADH, which will then increase the blood pressure, bring you back to normal, and therefore lead to less ADH being released, which brings you hopefully back to normal. So that would be a negative feedback example. The last one, when human increases physical activity. So the increase in CO2 in the blood reacts with water to make a weak acid. This lowers the pH of the blood. Sensory cells then register that and cause you to increase respiration. Just as a side note, it's kind of interesting that is how we know to breathe, is the increase in CO2 in our blood. So as you're working out or just living life and producing CO2, the CO2 causes your blood to become slightly acidic. Your brain picks up on that and registers that. That means you're not expelling enough CO2, which causes you to breathe more. It's part of the reason actually why, or it's the entire reason why the people who do like free diving, where they see how deep they can dive and hold their breath, they often hyperventilate before they do that. And the reason why they hyperventilate is not to get more oxygen. Your lungs can only hold so much oxygen, and only so much oxygen will diffuse into your into your bloodstream because of diffusion. Excuse me. So what they're actually doing is they're dumping their CO2, get as much CO2 out of their bloodstream as possible. So that way, as they're swimming down or holding their breath, it tricks their brain into thinking that we're fine because the CO2 levels don't get as high, when in reality they don't have any more oxygen than they normally would. And so it's also why that can be really dangerous, because you're sort of tricking your brain into thinking you're fine, even though you might not have enough oxygen to continue surviving. Anyway, so the low blood pH would be the stimulus, the increased respiration would be the response, and that's negative feedback, because as you respire more, you breathe out the CO2, which brings the pH back to normal, which stops the response. There you go. For the last section here, for either of these, we would have our three-part loop where you might have low blood pressure, leads to more ADH, leads to more water being reabsorbed, which then restores the blood pressure. It would be very similar to the loops we see on the very first page of this. Every single one's going to have a stimulus, a signal, and a response. For vicious cycle, I've talked about this. The idea of a vicious cycle is like a positive feedback loop where it's just uncontrolled and continues forever. There has to be some sort of exit strategy that will stop it. And then for this final one, it's kind of up to you. If you want to take some time and think about some of these different things, you could research into them. Every living thing and everything a living thing does really relates to feedback systems in some way, because these are all the controlling factors that keep us alive, that you have increased activity or decreased activity, and keeping that balance of homeostasis. So for any of these, you could find probably really good, simple feedback loops if you want to. You don't have to, but they can be interesting. And if anybody wants me to take a look at the feedback loops or the mechanisms and stuff that you came up with, I'm happy to do that. So there you go. Some about feedback. This is all feeding into our look into the endocrine system, which will be a good example of sort of the application of this. In fact, the endocrine system essentially is just like feedback systems on top of feedback systems on top of feedback systems. I think it'll be another opportunity for us to stop and look at the human body and just realize how it's insane that any of it actually works. So hope that's helpful. Email if you have questions. Thanks.